struggles for Palestine, as well as many other community social justice movements. With us tonight is Charlotte Kate. She's the coordinator of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee, and Khaled, Barakat, a Palestinian writer and activist from SAMIDOUN. This is the Palestine Prisoner Solidarity Network. And so what we're looking for tonight, and we hope to accomplish, we'll have a bit of time for questions and discussion afterwards as well, but to learn from these folks, it seems that there's a long history, and I'm sure you can begin to explain it a little bit, but even just if you look at what's happened in Vancouver recently with the poster campaign. You have a poster that was strictly like an informational campaign that was just mapping out from 1948 to now in 4 different panels how much land was Palestine and now how much land is Palestine. And you can see very clearly and very easily delineated on these maps that were on buses and transit in Vancouver how the territory has shrunk. And there's been a massive dispossession of land for the Palestinians. So just this factual presentation, maybe you can describe more about what the repression was around it, but it had so much backlash and so much anger has been raised that it seemed to me that it was very frustrating. It must have been very frustrating. But also, it seems that people made it out to be far more complicated than it needs to be. When we look at what the basic nuts and bolts of human needs are involved, if you look at people's needs for freedom, from arbitrary detention and from arbitrary arrest, and for food, for shelter, for security, basic issues like this. This is the nuts and bolts of what organizing is about. And so it need not to be as complicated. And so this is what we hope to accomplish from this, is ways that folks can learn also when they're putting together their own campaigns and communities, the nuts and bolts of organizing for an advocacy, for a struggle. So we thank you very much for your opportunity to speak with us tonight. And also, as just before we begin, I'd like to also ask if there's anyone who is interested, after my brief and less than articulate description maybe of the Critical Criminology Working Group, but if you'd like to be involved in more, we will have upcoming events. There's radical apologists coming in October, which we're really excited to present. Layla, forgotten her first name, sorry, Layla. And also in November, we're looking to organize an event around the terrorist listing and the Canadian government formation of a list of official groups that are terrorists. And we'd like to speak against that and why that's unnecessary, and so that will be in November. And there will be other events in between. We're also really excited that there will be a grand powwow on Kwantlen campus this Friday night, and I would encourage everyone to come out to that. This is in honor of the recognition of the struggles of those families who've survived the residential school system in Canada, which is another gross injustice that requires our attention. And Lisa Monchelin, who is here, right here in front, if you have any questions, can tell you more about that. That's on Friday. So feel free to ask. So if you'd like to sign up, I've put 3 columns here. The first one, you can add your name and email if you're interested. And the first one is I'll just add you to our list for announcements. The second column, you can check if you'd be interested in coming out to meetings to plan to help poster for our upcoming events. And the final column is if you'd like to have more information from SAMIDOUN. So if you'd like to put your name down on any one of those 3, just add your name and email and pass it to the next person. Thank you very much. I promise that we won't pass it on pennies to you. Okay, so with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Charlotte then. And is everything good with the video?
Seems to be.
Very much. Great.
Thanks so much, PJ, and thanks so much to Jeff and the Critical Criminology Working Group at Kwantlen for having us here today. We're very pleased to be here today. I'm going to probably spend most of my time speaking from over here because I do have PowerPoint presentations, so just to get that going. First, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we're having this event on unceded post-Salish territory because we're part of the settler colonial system here in Canada. And the reason why that's relevant is because it's very similar to what's happened in Palestine. It's just that what's happened in Palestine has taken place in the past 65 years, and what's taken place in Canada has taken place over hundreds of years. And so just as much as we're standing in solidarity with Palestinian political prisoners and Palestinian struggles for self-determination, it's important for us as an organization to be conscious of the fact that we're engaging in that solidarity movement here on the land of another people whose land was stolen, was taken in a process of colonization. I just want to ask, can people hear me without the microphone, or is it easier for people if I use the microphone? Microphone? Okay. So I'm going to provide a general introduction of the situation of Palestinian political prisoners, and Khaled is going to provide a more in-depth description of one particular Palestinian political leader's case as a Palestinian political prisoner right now. So first I'm just going to present some numbers, and these are some striking numbers, some statistics, and right now I'm giving you those numbers without giving a lot of background to them. So we see that there are 5,200 current political prisoners, Palestinian political prisoners held in Israeli jails. 134 of them are administrative detainees. That means they're held without charge or trial. 13 are women, the rest are men. There used to be more women prisoners, but there was a prisoner exchange agreement in which the majority of women prisoners were freed. 13 of them are Palestinian Legislative Council members, and nearly 200 of them are children. And these are other breakdowns of kind of where folks are from in terms of what area of Palestine that they were taken from and what area of Palestine they live in. So when we're talking about Palestine, we might as well start out at the beginning. I'm not sure what folks' level of familiarity is with Palestine, and most of you might already know this information since you're here at a discussion of Palestinian political prisoners, but to go back to the beginning, these are the maps that PJ was talking about, and this is the ad that the Palestine Awareness Coalition, a coalition of 7 Vancouver area human rights and social justice organizations sponsored these ads to appear on buses around Vancouver as well as appearing on the Vancouver City Centre SkyTrain station wall as a wall mural. And what these maps depict is the history of the Palestinian struggle over the past 65 years, and in particular, the history of the colonization of Palestine as depicted graphically. So you see that this is the land, this is the area known as Palestine, and of course it's in what we call the Middle East or the Arab world, next to Jordan, next to Egypt, next to Lebanon and Syria, just so we're kind of situating it in its geography in that sense. But this area, this land, has been known historically as the land of Palestine. I don't want to go into too much detail because we're not going to have a conversation about the entirety of Palestinian history today, except to note that Palestine has been under the control of many empires over time, including the Ottoman Empire, later the British Empire following World War I. And at the time that we see here in 1946, the Zionist movement, which was a European-based movement that was centered in mostly right-wing Jewish communities that saw Jewish communities as a nation that needed a state, and specifically a state in the land of Palestine because of the kind of biblical history that it evoked, were engaged in a colonial project in Palestine, and I want to distinguish that from a process of immigration. Because we weren't looking at people coming as immigrants to the land of Palestine to live, we were looking at an organized colonial project that identified itself in that fashion. And so the land that we see here in white had been purchased often from absentee landlords by organizations like the Jewish National Fund, which exists today, or the World Zionist Organization, in an attempt to buy up the land that would create a Jewish state in Palestine. And this was meant to be an exclusively Jewish state to the detriment of the indigenous Arab Palestinian population of the land. As you can see, this project wasn't very successful because only the white areas that we see here were actually purchased in 1946, and the rest of the land remained as it had been for centuries and for millennia, with cities and villages and farms tilled by indigenous Palestinian people. the Zionist movement, after World War II, of course, we're all aware of the atrocities and the Holocaust that was committed against Jews in Europe by the Nazis. The Zionist movement sought to draw support from European powers for creation of a Jewish state in Palestine after the horrors that had been committed by the Nazis, and also rather than seeking reparations from European powers for the crimes that they had committed against European Jews, instead the state of Palestine allowed those reparations to be given, but at the expense of Palestinian Arabs who had not committed the crimes against European Jews in Europe. The Zionist movement, the United States, and Britain and other powers proposed that the land of Palestine should be divided, and that 55% of the land would go to create a new Jewish state, and 45% of the land, what we see in UN Plan 1947, would be retained for the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. In fact, both sides rejected this plan because both the Zionist movement wanted all of the land, and of course the people whose country and whose land it was were not ready to give up the majority of their land to the sovereignty of what was going to be labeled an exclusively Jewish state. So there was the pre-state Israeli military groups launched a war, and in the process of launching that war, which they called a war of independence, but was really a war of extermination against the Palestinian people, nearly 1 million Palestinians were expelled from their land and forced into refuge. That's why we see at the bottom 5 million Palestinians are today classified as refugees by the United Nations. Palestinians still form the world's largest refugee population today, now actually second. The number of Syrian refugees is actually approaching that number, is actually approaching a really large number as well. But it's one of the 2 largest refugee populations in the world today. And that's because Palestinians have been denied their right to return home, which has been recognized in international law since 1948. After the war, you see the armistice line here. You see that 78% of Palestine was colonized, and what remains is what we call today the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And in fact, even that's been taken away bit by bit with Israeli settlements, which are kind of different colonies that are planted in the West Bank to encircle Palestinian cities, Israeli-only roads that are built, so-called military zones, security zones, and all of these things have been constructed in order to have more and more of the land and fewer Arabs, fewer and fewer Palestinians. And so this is the context in which we're talking about Palestinian political prisoners. We're speaking about a context in which people have been dispossessed of their land, deprived of their rights, subject to colonialism, and denied their ability to practice any form of sovereignty, self-determination, national rights, individual rights, or human rights on their own land. And so we see that the prisons are actually distributed throughout Palestinian land, throughout all of this land is called Palestine. The part that became the white part, is the Israeli state. It's also sometimes referred to as Palestine 48 because it's the part of Palestine that was occupied in 1948. And it's also what's recognized as the state of Israel. And the green parts are what's recognized as the West Bank and Gaza. But what we see in 2012 is this is the reality of the actual areas which Palestinians are confined to. I'm not sure if people have seen the images of the apartheid wall. It's a 25-foot wall that's been constructed, kind of winding through Palestinian land, encircling entire cities, and kind of creating a prison-like environment for Palestinians to live on their own land. The prisons are basically distributed throughout Palestine. As you see, most of them are within the green line, within the borders of Israel, within Palestine 48. And this means, this has a lot of consequences. It means that it's in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention to transfer prisoners there. But beyond that, it also means that Palestinians are often denied family visits because their family members aren't given permits to go see them. It means that Palestinians have very little access to their own community even when they're being held in prison. So when we think about Palestinian prisoners, about these 5,200 people held in Israeli jails, there are a lot of images that people, and ideas that many people might have and perhaps not yourself, because many of you are looking at criminology and engaging in a critical look at the process of imprisonment and jails and structures of criminalization. But people think, oh, well, people who are in prison, they must have done something wrong. They must have committed a crime. And the definition of a crime, of course, matters on who's defining that crime. And if the crime is being defined as stealing people's land, destroying people's homes, destroying people's livelihood, we can hold the Israeli state accountable for those crimes. But it's the Israeli state and its military that has the power to define those crimes inside Palestine. And so when we talk about who Palestinian prisoners are, there really isn't one identity that Palestinian prisoners have. They're community leaders, they're political leaders, they can also be students, workers, they're women and men, they're family members, they're children and youth. They range from young people who are literally detained for walking down the street or for playing or for not being compliant enough at a checkpoint, and who can be taken to prison and held and brought before military courts for that crime, to talking about resistance fighters, to talking about political leaders who are writing essays and engaging and holding meetings. So you have a whole spectrum of Palestinians who are constantly subject to the threat of arrest and imprisonment. And it's a constant threat because there are checkpoints, military checkpoints, around every major Palestinian city and between Palestinian towns and cities and villages. And so you're constantly in interactions with the Israeli military and having to show your ID everywhere you go. And at any one of those times, if that interaction goes the wrong way for a Palestinian, that person is subject to arrest, detention, interrogation, and the threat of imprisonment. So we know that since 1967, around 750,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned by Israel for political reasons, and those are people that have been sentenced. 40% of Palestinian men have spent time in Israeli detention or prison, and every Palestinian family is affected by mass imprisonment. There's always a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a cousin, an aunt, or an uncle who has spent time in prisons. And this is a universal experience that you'll find, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. But given how Palestinian families are extended and spread around the world, it's really in every Palestinian community. Virtually every Palestinian prisoner has faced some form of torture or abuse during their arrest and interrogation. And again, as we know that these prisoners are held inside Israel in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits the transfer of prisoners outside occupied territory. And that's why when people refer to the West Bank and Gaza, they often use the phrase the occupied Palestinian territories, because those, even though all of Palestine is occupied, the West Bank and Gaza are held as occupied territory under international law. There have been numerous UN resolutions passed about them kind of recognizing that status. And so that transfer of prisoners is actually a direct violation of international law to which Israel has actually agreed. Palestinians who say they're arrested at home, often in night raids, in the street, at checkpoints, in many places. There are undercover officers or Israeli soldiers who often come in large numbers of jeeps, military vehicles, tanks to make an arrest. But then again, people can also be picked up at a checkpoint while they're crossing to go somewhere. People can be picked up kind of at random times during the day, and it's not always anticipated when someone's going to be arrested. During the process, family members are often threatened, they're harassed, offices are ransacked, homes are ransacked. Always computers, cell phones, and other forms of electronics are always taken and searched. And detainees are taken to an interrogation center. This is just one person, a 17-year-old, who's telling this disturbing story regarding his own arrest and in a testimony that he provided to an organization called Defense for Children International, which is an organization that specifically advocates for the rights of Palestinian children who are detained in Israeli prisons. In a number of cases, there are mass arrests, especially at times when there's a high level of resistance in an area or a high level of uprising, a large number of protests. In the first half of the 2000s, during what was called the Second Intifada, this happened on numerous occasions, time and time again. Areas, all basically young men in an area would be called down to the center of town and would be rounded up and taken in for interrogation. A large number of them would be released, but in the meantime, it would be an extremely traumatic experience for people. Oftentimes, people would be strip searched, people would be denied access to food, denied access to the washroom, would be abused, would be humiliated, would be shouted at, would be threatened. And this policy continues to be practiced today. And interestingly, and awfully, we've actually seen more and more of these arrest raids, and they've been becoming even more and more violent in the past few months. There have been a number of young Palestinians, particularly in refugee camps in the West Bank, who have been killed. Just the last one yesterday, Kwantlen who was killed in Jenin refugee camp, and he was 22 years old. And all of these young people were killed during arrest raids. When Palestinians would say, surround the Israeli soldiers or the tanks that came in. And again, we're talking about highly armed Israeli soldiers, tanks, military jeeps, military vehicles. And they would claim that they were afraid for their lives, or that someone had thrown rocks at them, and that that's why they had to shoot to kill Palestinians. And so we've seen just 4 or 5 Palestinians in the last few weeks, all in refugee camps, who have, actually 6 who have been shot and who have been killed, all during arrest raids. And so what we see is that arrest raids are now not just for taking prisoners, they're actually becoming occasions for killing as well. And that's an escalation of the violence, the constant violence that Palestinians are suffering under occupation and colonialism, but specifically an escalation of the violence that's taking place during arrest raids. And once a Palestinian has been arrested, Palestinian detainees, they're blindfolded, they're definitely threatened, and they're often beaten. There are 15 detention and interrogation centers throughout Palestine, and this is where Palestinian prisoners are taken before sentencing, before administrative detention, while they're being interrogated, while the Israeli army is trying to get information from them. Oftentimes, folks are held in settlements, in the same illegal settlements on Palestinian land in the West Bank, where settlers are living. This is the same place where Palestinian detainees are brought to be interrogated. People are denied contact with their families. They're also denied any access to legal representation. They're denied being brought before a judge. They're denied access to anything in the outside world that might deter them from being part of the interrogation process. And we can see that one thing that's become a constant report is that Palestinian detainees and prisoners have been subject to torture. Now, there are many times when the Israeli Supreme Court is actually hailed because they ruled that some forms of torture were illegal, and that instead only so-called moderate physical pressure was allowed. So therefore, forms of torture that left the worst marks were not allowed, and those that weren't were. And so that's why we've heard that, and we've seen in testimony from U.S. soldiers and others, that Israeli experts in interrogation were brought in to train U.S. soldiers who went to Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, who practiced same torture techniques there that relied oftentimes on psychological torture, the use of sleep deprivation, the use of threats of sexual abuse, denial of food, denial of water, use of noise abuse and playing really loud music, refusing to allow people to sleep, and putting people in stress positions, like handcuffing them to chairs and holding them there in those positions for hours, to the point that people's muscles become constricted and they're unable to move and actually lead to severe pain and contraction of the muscles. And this has been an experience that probably 90% at least of Palestinian prisoners and detainees have reported when they've been interviewed after their detention by advocacy organizations who represent Palestinian prisoners in legal cases and to the International Committee of the Red Cross and other organizations. And of course, the reason why this is being done is to put pressure on Palestinians to give in, to collaborate, to say that they'll give information about their neighbors, their friends, the members of their family, and around anyone who might be considered a threat or engaged in active opposition to the occupation. And that's the reason why torture takes place. It's not just cool, it has a purpose. It has a purpose, and that purpose is to incentivize collaboration. After the stage of detention and interrogation, which can last quite some time, in many cases Even after people have had some access to a judge, they're brought back again and again to extend their interrogation period. But after that time, there are two routes that can happen to a Palestinian detainee at this point. They could be released. They could say, we've gotten all we can from you, we're not getting anything from you, and they could release this person and send them back. And of course, that person's always at a risk of getting arrested again. That person could be held over for something called administrative detention, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, without charge or trial, or they could be charged with something. And it's really important to note that Palestinians can be charged with almost anything. Membership in any Palestinian political party, including the Fatah party, the political party of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, even though that party's leadership is engaged in negotiations with the Israeli state right now, membership in the Fatah party is still illegal, and you can still go to jail for it. It's still classified as a hostile organization. This is also the case for most student associations, women's associations. It's not that every person is being prosecuted at any given time, but there's always an opportunity or an excuse to prosecute any Palestinian at any given time. And this is because Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza live under military law. They don't live under a codified legal system. I mean, as problematic as codified legal systems are, that's not what they're dealing with. They're dealing with a military system which is arbitrary and which can be changed at any time by the military officials in charge of the West Bank. They appear before military courts, which are presided over by members of the military, by three-judge panels. Israeli citizens are tried under Israeli civil law and not by military courts. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these military orders. And I think this statistic really speaks for itself. The military courts have a 99.74% conviction rate. So out of every 10,000 people who go before them, 9,974 of them are convicted. These military courts exist for one purpose, and that's to send Palestinians to jail. And these are just some examples of some of the military orders under which Palestinians live. Palestinians can still be penalized for raising the Palestinian flag, even when the Palestinian flag was raised in the Knesset under the auspices of negotiation. Publishing political leaflets, conducting meetings with more than 10 people, being a member of a political party. Land can be confiscated for any security reason, and there's even a military order which governs how Palestinians can grow flowers. So there's really military orders that govern every aspect of Palestinian life and are constantly at risk of being arbitrarily changed. After sentencing, Palestinian prisoners are sent to prisons. They're located inside Israel. And Palestinian prisoners, they're forbidden from getting telephone calls. There's often kind of actions to sneak mobile phones into prisons because people want to be able to speak to their families on the outside. They're denied phone calls. They can't get family visits because people are denied permits to visit their families. So any kind of mechanism for communication with the outside world is deeply welcome. And so there are constant raids inside the prisons, ransacking of prison cells, searching of people's belongings, transferring people from one prison to another, and all of these repressive actions against people inside the prisons are justified on the basis of searching for cell phones. And detainees continue to face abuse by prison guards, face denial of medical treatment, again, kind of attacks with batons and tear gas, often again under the pretext of looking for cell phones. An administrative detention, which I mentioned before, is kind of the other path that people can take and still be in prison. This detention without charge or trial is arbitrary detention. It's indefinitely renewable for up to 6 months at a time. And people have been held in administrative detention for 4 or 5 years straight, without ever being charged with anything, without ever being tried for anything. A secret file is presented to an Israeli military judge by the intelligence agency. The person does not have any opportunity to respond. Their lawyer is not allowed to see the file. They have no information to respond to, and pretty much almost every administrative detention order that's requested by the intelligence agencies is okayed by the military judges. And this is Palestinian academic Ahmed Hakamish. He's been recognized as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. He's been in administrative detention for 2 years since April 2011, and his administrative detention was just renewed about 2 weeks ago for another 6 months. And there are a number of violations of international law, and there's a few different frameworks in which people often talk about Palestine. One of them is human rights and international law. And another one, which is complementary but different, is about kind of popular resistance to colonialism. But both of them are applicable to talking about the situation of Palestinian political prisoners. Palestinian resistance fighters are denied prisoner of war status, even though, according to corollaries to the Geneva Conventions, they should be accorded that status. Palestinian prisoners are again moved outside their occupied lands. Torture takes place in violation of the Convention Against Torture. Targeting of political activists and human rights defenders in violation of international conventions on human rights defenders and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And administrative detention is actually in violation of international law on arbitrary detention. Now, of course, the U.S. violates that law. Canada was certainly violating that law with security certificates. But these are clear violations of international law that are currently taking place. And I just want to highlight also the crime of apartheid, which is defined as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Because we talk a lot about Israeli apartheid, and sometimes people respond and say, well, things are different. South Africa isn't the same as Palestine, or Israel did this and South Africa did that, and that's why they're different. And that's true, but apartheid isn't about being just like South Africa. Apartheid is about if a country, if a state is committing acts that fit this definition. And so when we look at this definition in light of what's happening to Palestinian prisoners, and we see that Israel has defined itself as an exclusively Jewish state to the exception of even its own Palestinian and Arab citizens, and certainly to the detriment of Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza. And that all of when we look at how Israeli courts and Israeli military courts function, we see that an entirely different system exists for those people under occupation and those people who are not. They're military courts versus civilian courts. There's a massive sentencing differential. Even Israeli settlers who are within the Green Line, who are in illegal settlements on expropriated Palestinian land, when settlers are arrested for, and sometimes they are even arrested, often they're not, for kind of violence against Palestinians in the area, such as killing people, hitting people with cars, throwing rocks at them, burning their olive trees. Most of the time settlers are just let go. But even when you have cases of murder where settlers are sentenced, one settler was sentenced to, I believe, 6 months in prison for killing a 6-year-old Palestinian girl. So when we compare that to Palestinians sentenced to 3 years in prison for being a member of a political party, we can clearly see the kind of sentencing, apartheid-level sentencing differential that exists. Security prisoners, which includes Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who are arrested on political charges, are labeled as security prisoners, a different kind of prisoner than the kind of prisoners labeled civil or criminal prisoners. Security prisoners are the ones who are denied family visits, denied access to the telephone, denied visitation rights, denied conjugal visits. And at the same time, Israeli criminal prisoners, who are citizens of Israel and who are members of the majority ethnicity, are allowed access to all of those things. Are allowed weekend leave, are allowed to leave the prisons, are allowed to visit their families, not just have their families come visit them, they're allowed to go home for the weekend. And this is the case even for Israeli prisoners that are convicted of crimes like murder and rape. So again, we see the vast differential. Palestinian children are treated as adults, and Israeli children are treated as juveniles. 18 years old is a cutoff that matters for Israeli citizens, and it's not for Palestinians. And of course, we look at arbitrary military orders versus codified law. But at the same time, Palestinian prisoners are resisting. There have been hunger strikes that have included thousands of Palestinian prisoners. Just in 2012, there were thousands of Palestinian prisoners that were on hunger strike demanding an end to solitary confinement. It received massive attention around the world. It apparently set records on Twitter and Facebook in terms of the amount of attention that it got, at least at the time. And there were actually some victories there, which was that 19 prisoners that were held in solitary confinement, often political leaders, were let out of solitary confinement, returned to the general population. Family visits were increased, and there were a couple of other victories that were won out of that
but at the same time, the Israeli state actually agreed to many more concessions in order to end the hunger strike, but what we've seen is that those promises were broken. And this is the poster in solidarity that was created for the hunger strike. This is Ahmed Sadat. He's a Palestinian political leader. He was held in solitary confinement for over 3 years until the end of this hunger strike. And at the bottom, there's a picture of Kader Adnan with Yasser Adnani. And Kader Adnan helped to relaunch the current hunger strike movement. He was held in administrative detention and went on hunger strike, kind of gaining international attention and drawing new attention to the Palestinian movement. And he's with Yasser Adnani, who's a former prisoner herself, a Palestinian rights activist, and today she herself is detained in Israeli prisons. And so I just want to draw attention to Canadian policy, especially after we've talked about what Israel's policies are. Israel embodies principles that Canada values and respects. It is a beacon of light in a region that craves freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So that's what John Baird has to say about what happens to Palestinian political prisoners and the colonization of Palestine. And when we say this is happening, you may ask why? Well, because Israel, as we saw at the beginning when we looked at the maps, is a settler colonial state. It's based on taking more and more of the land and having fewer and fewer of the indigenous people of that land. And so that means making life difficult, that means making life hard, that means encouraging people to leave. And Palestinians as a class, as a people, are subject to mass imprisonment, to criminalization, to constant suspicion, to being labeled as the other and unwelcome on their own land where they've lived for millennia. This is Israeli state policy. It's not the action of a violent guard here or there, or a military official that got out of hand. It's the mass criminalization of resistance and targeting of Palestinians. And it's become a means of suppressing resistance, because Palestinians want freedom. They want their rights. They want their land. They want to be able to be free. They want the same thing that people want everywhere around the world. But if even taking the slightest action in support of that freedom might render you even more subject to imprisonment, to the conditions we just discussed, it takes even more strength, even more community strength to surmount that and be able to organize. And so that's why Palestinians are subject to mass criminalization. It's designed to uphold occupation and keep apartheid in place. And you should note here that the Palestinian Authority that officially recognized PA has a role to play in this as well. According to the agreements that it's signed with Israel, it has responsibility to do what's called security cooperation, which means turning over information on where Palestinians are and arresting people that might be suspected of committing resistance activities. So there's an internal struggle that takes place around this as well. And it affects all Palestinians. Palestinian citizens of Israel aren't given equal rights to their fellow Israeli citizens who are not Palestinians. Instead, when they're accused of a political crime, they're called security prisoners. And it's not the case that Jewish Israelis that are accused of what might be classified as political crimes or crimes of violence that are motivated by politics aren't subject to that designation. They get the same rights as other civil and criminal prisoners. But Palestinians don't. They're called security prisoners, and they're treated like Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, except that Israel refuses to discuss them in negotiations about release of prisoners. Palestinians are criminalized en masse. There's a terrorist label that's been created, and that terrorist label doesn't just exist inside Israeli and Palestinian political discourse. It comes here and it exists in the US and Canada and elsewhere. And Palestinians everywhere are impacted by this labeling. When we look at the terrorist list, as PJ mentioned earlier, we see Palestinian political party after Palestinian political party listed on these lists. And what we do see when we look at US jails and European jails and elsewhere are Palestinians and their allies being held and often sentenced for terms of large numbers of years, not because they injured anybody, not because they hurt anybody, but because they raised money to send home to organizations that even the US government doesn't dispute were doing charitable activities and nothing else with the money. But because the same organizations are supporters of political parties that have been labeled as terrorists and therefore criminalized, and that this entire process was created in order to forward U.S. and other foreign policy in the region. So even Palestinians outside, which because of the massive Palestinian refugee population is actually the majority of Palestinians, are impacted by political imprisonment and labeling. And so then the question comes in, what can we do about it here? Because we're here and we're not in Palestine, and we see that Canadian policy is pretty bad, but what can we do? Well, one thing that Palestinian civil society has called for is called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It means we can boycott Israeli goods and products. We can not embark on joint projects with Israeli academic institutions or bring Israeli cultural exhibits that are sponsored by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's some websites for some more information about BDS. BDSmovement.net is the global Palestinian website, and boycottisraeliapartheid.org is for Vancouver-based information. It's also good to note here G4S. G4S is the second largest private employer in the world. It's the world's largest security corporation. It provides security at Vancouver International Airport, and it's also the same company that provides security services in Israeli prisons holding Palestinian prisoners. Right now there's a global campaign to call on governments and organizations that have contracts with G4S to divest from them until they stop until they end their contract. And of course there are a number of human rights abuses that G4S is involved in outside Palestine as well. But this is a global call that people are involved in around the world. And it's actually had some success in Europe. Several of their contracts have been dropped after kind of large public outcries. And for solidarity actions about the prisoners, you can find more at SAMIDOUN.ca. And this is just to give some examples of current prisoners that are being held. This is Hassan Faraja. He's a Palestinian youth leader, coordinator of the Stop the Wall campaign to demand an end to the apartheid wall that has actually been tearing apart Palestinian agricultural land. And he wrote a letter from prison in which he said, they've imprisoned the body, but they could not jail the idea and will not be able to do so. And I think that he speaks for a lot of Palestinian prisoners when he says that. This is Yasser Atani. We saw her picture earlier. She's a former prisoner and detainee, and she's currently being held for 3 months for entering the Israeli state without a permit in order to visit a friend. And her sentence is actually much longer than people usually receive for entering without a permit, and that's because of her political activity. And in fact, her interrogation period was extended several times, but apparently they weren't able to get any information from her. And this is Anas Barghouti. He's a Palestinian lawyer. He was just detained on Sunday. He has represented a number of Palestinian prisoners in court, and he was picked up at a checkpoint called the Container Checkpoint outside Ramallah. And we have an action going for him right now at SAMIDOUN.ca. If you want to send a letter to Israeli officials and say that this person is a human rights defender and shouldn't be imprisoned, then please do so and join us in taking that action. And so this is SAMIDOUN.ca. This is our website. You can learn more about it there. But before we go on into Q&A and discussion, I know that Khaled is going to share some information about Ahmed Sadat, who's a Palestinian political prisoner and a Palestinian political leader.
Thank you, Khaled. I promise you I'll be quick. And thank you, Charlotte, for this great presentation. Every time I hear Charlotte, I learn more and more, even though I am Palestinian, born in Palestine, raised in Palestine. But it's important to speak about the conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in sometimes simple words, because, you know, often I ran into people who tells me that that place is very complicated, the Middle East, they're always fighting, we can't understand what's the problems, and the media try to present it as a very complex conflict, but in reality it's really about equality, justice, freedom, the values that we all struggle for and that we want to see dominating the entire world, not an exclusive on one nation or one particular country and denied on the rest of the world. So the conflict in Palestine is a national liberation movement that represents Palestinians, and this national liberation movement is when you speak to people in India, they immediately relate because they have fought colonialism. They know what colonization means. They know what imprisonment means. They have also a rich struggle in India. When you talk to people in South Africa, they also relate to Palestinian struggle because they themselves, and until now, they're in South Africa engaged in a struggle for equality and for an alternative society where no one group oppresses the other just because they're more powerful. They create the law and they set the courts and the system and everything, and they oppress the others. Also here in Canada, when I speak to my comrades who are strugglers and activists in the native and indigenous struggle in Canada, they also relate immediately to Palestinians. So it is a struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor. It is the struggle of those who don't have power against those who have all the power. And Israel as a state and as a system was created by the Western colonies and Western power, and it remains until today in the Arab world, in the heart of the Arab world, serving the interest of these imperialist powers. And that's why Israel has this special status in Canada and in the US and in Western Europe, particularly in France and Germany, is because the relationship between these powers and Israel is the relationship between, one camp, friends and allies. And so I want to talk about a specific case because national liberation movements and revolutionary parties usually they have a leadership. And one of the Palestinian leaders who's currently in prison and serving a sentence of 30 years in prison, his name is Ahmed Saadat. But before we go to Ahmed Saadat, the previous picture, this is Abu Ali Mustafa. He is a national Palestinian leader who was assassinated by Israel in August 27, 2001. Two Apache helicopter fired missiles at his office at around 9 o'clock in the morning when he was just entering his office. And of course he was killed immediately. His party, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, elected Ahmed Saadat. And Ahmed Saadat was born in 1953, and he's a refugee from a village called Deir Tarif in 1948, which Charlotte explained. It's what's the areas that was occupied in 48. His family, when they were refugees in 48, he was born as a refugee in a refugee camp called the Dura refugee camp, and later lived in Albira area. Ahmed Saadat, he's a teacher, a mathematics teacher. He studied to be a teacher, but he got involved in the struggle at a very early age. So he spent a total of over 20 years of his life in and out from Israeli prison since age 17. Since he was 17 years old, and he joined the student movement. He was arrested and repeatedly arrested, and now he is the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and he was arrested. Actually, he was in jail under the Palestinian Authority supervision, and later the Israeli army invaded that prison and abducted him, kidnapped him with other Palestinian inmates and prisoners, and took them in an Israeli prison. They accused him of orchestrating an assassination against an Israeli minister. His name is Rahba'am Zehevi. He's a right-wing Israeli minister of tourism then, but well known for his advocacy to transfer all Palestinians from their land to outside of Palestine. He is a representative or a theoretician behind ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And he was assassinated by the group that Ahmed Sa'dat lead in response to the assassination of Abu Ali Mustafa. So here we have a case of an action and a reaction, but you cannot look at this situation or at this incident in isolation from the entire question. When you go deeper into the lives of these leaders and of the organization that they represent, it is an organization that long time have cultural institutions, women organizations, student organizations, over 40 years of engagement in the struggle with the workers and the factories and with the farmers and fishers. So it's not, when you hear the word terrorist organization, especially in our media here, it immediately they create an image of a bunch of guys who have guns and all they want to do is start killing people. But when you really get engaged in the history of Palestinian struggle and especially those who can even make it to Palestine and visit Palestine and actually get engaged with Palestinians as people with culture, people with history, and people with a very rich heritage. It is important to realize that the organization that Ahmed Sa'dat leads is listed in Canada and in our laws here as a terrorist organization by the Canadian state. So Canada gets involved in the conflict, and Canada official position, the government gets involved, on the footsteps of the United States, because we know that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is a strategic partners of two imperialist power. We know that the U.S. is the hegemonic power, and Canada kind of follower. But the fact of the matter is that the Canadian government takes sides in this conflict, and they take the side of the oppressor and not the oppressed. So the reason also we're addressing the case of Ahmed Sa'dat is because we are launching a campaign, a global campaign, in support of Palestinian prisoners and in support of him, asking for his immediate release. It would be from the 17th to 24th of October this year. And we did similar campaign last year in which events were held in Denmark, Germany, France, Canada, the US, and Chile, some of the Latin American countries, and of course in Palestine and the Arab world. So, but just a little bit to touch in life inside prison in Palestine. Prisoners are, who are these Palestinian prisoners, the 5,200 that Charlotte mentioned? And if you look at their lives and their backgrounds, these are the leaders of the women movement, the student movement. These are our best students in universities. Those students who organize the student movement, those students who help out students from refugee backgrounds, or poor students who cannot pay their tuitions. These are the students engaged in the struggle in Palestinian society, but at the same time a struggle against occupation. So we have sort of a two-pillar struggle. We struggle for national liberation against the occupation, but we also struggle within the Palestinian society because we also have a Palestinian minority class that also oppresses Palestinians, and they try to benefit from their collaboration with the occupation. So sort of collaborators who set up a government and called it the PA, And this PA, the Palestinian Authority, is engaged with Israel in all sorts of economic and military and security cooperation that harms Palestinians and harms our people. So yes, Israel, the US, Canada, and some of these Palestinians and regimes, the local regimes in the area, are all complicit in the oppression of the Palestinian people. Life inside prisons also is very organized. Yes, there is a lot of oppression, but there is resistance inside prison. Palestinian prisoners have gained their rights through hunger strikes since 1967 up until today. Palestinian prisoner movement always were engaged in hunger strikes, petitions, all forms of struggle in prison in order to achieve rights. So now, for example, they do have their libraries, they can have access to books, but these rights that we take for granted here, there it was achieved with a lot of pain and blood, and prisoners have died for these rights, similar to the struggle of political prisoners, for example, in Northern Ireland or South Africa, because these movements, they learn from each other history, and they also try to provide an alternative relationship between people based on solidarity and mutual respect and cooperation, rather than oppression, racism, and ruling. So I encourage you to, when you have time and if you really would like to get engaged in learning more about Palestinian struggle, and the Palestinian prisoner struggle is in the heart of this struggle, then you would also learn about the leadership of the labor movements. Many of them are in prison. Leadership of the Palestinian women movement, student movement, youth movement, that Charlotte showed us some of the examples of these friends and sisters and comrades. And so I'll stop here, and thank you again for allowing us to talk to you and address this very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks very much for coming, both of you. That was a speech. There's lots of information there to process, and I'm not sure how this is fitting in with your class discussion, but I'd like to open up the floor to questions and discussion. If there's anyone who has anything that they'd like further clarification on, or questions about organizing in Vancouver.
I guess my question would be, it's a national struggle to establish Palestinian state, correct? Eventually to establish
the struggle
is a national struggle.
Yeah, well, the struggle, the essence of the Palestinian struggle is for the liberation of the land and the people. And this will lead to the right of Palestinians to practice a right, universal right, that everyone have the right to every nation, which is self-determination. Because of our situation, Palestinians, over 50% of Palestinians live outside Palestine. They live in refugee camps. These people were displaced from Palestine in 48 and some of them in 67. So until the Palestinian refugees are able to practice their right to return to their land and their home, along with the people inside Palestine, in order to be able to practice that self-determination in the real sense of the word. Because you can't call someone free when he's in prison. They have to be outside of prison and free from all the conditions around them in order to be fully free. Freedom doesn't come, 50% freedom, 30% freedom. Either you're free or you're not free. So it's important to understand that the state, and I know there is a lot of talk about Palestinians want state. It's the state that the Palestinian Authority wants to have. It is basically apartheid as we see it in reality. Because where are we going to have the state? Israel, as Charlotte showed us in the maps, have divided Palestinian territories, even the one that was occupied in '67, into Pantostans and reserves, camps. So every Palestinian city and area and village is circulated by either a bypass roads that is only used by settlers, Israeli settlers, or Jewish use only, and the rest of the population have to live in a completely different system. And so it is not just apartheid, it is a colonialist military form of apartheid that unprecedented in the humankind history. Because when you go there and you see the relationship, it's more than just a colonizer who's there to stay for a certain period of time and leaving, like in the case of Egypt and India and elsewhere. It is a system that is there to confiscate land and push the native indigenous population outside of their land. The motto that drives this Zionist idea of more land and less Arabs is that's why the problem is always the expansions of these settlements, the expansions of these, of occupation, because the nature of colonialist states is expansionist. They can stay within a limited border. That's why Israel is the only state that doesn't have defined borders or constitution. So in this way, I don't know if I was clear or not, but the Palestinian state is an illusion that they're trying to sell to the world in order to buy more time and just keep the process going. Because the United States and Israel are interested in the process, is that they show you in the media there is negotiations and they're talking. But in reality, there is no hope for a Palestinian state. The real hope that we have, and the real solution, is when Palestinians and the land of Palestine are liberated, and when all people in Palestine live under equal laws and live in dignity together in one society.
Does that answer your question? Is that a
Well, I guess what I'm asking is that a denial of the Israel state, the state of Israel, that is, they should just leave the whole area.
Instead of a two-state solution, a no-state solution?
We're talking about there's a difference between each. So I just want to distinguish between states and people, right? So, and I think that I think that Khaled did that in the answer. So there's a difference between the state of Israel as a state and people who were born in that land and now have a right to be in that land because they were born there. That's now their land. Right now they have colonialist privilege, but and they have to sacrifice that privilege, right?
And
I guess I'm just asking what your solution is. That's
yes. No, I think it's a very important question. I think it's a very important question. But when you have a racist colonialist state, you should not shy away from saying, yes, we want to dismantle this state. And we do want to dismantle Israel because Israel doesn't serve nor the Jewish people or the Palestinian people. Because as long as you have this system of colonization and apartheid, then you're just offering some kind of a bandage to a very deep one that it's not going to be. You have to treat it from the roots of the problem, and that is to for Palestinians to gain back their rights, and for people in that land to live under equal law. And if you're asking me, are you denying the legitimacy of the state of Israel, my answer is yes. Israel is not a legitimate state.
So it's been going on since before I was born, and I really have not been
you mentioned Canadian policy, and I mean, I originally came from the U.S. and now I'm here, but Canadian policy, U.S. policy, and the policies of these governments is that actually is a way in which we have a concrete connection to this. We're not just choosing a struggle that's somewhere and saying like, oh, now this struggle is really important and we should focus on it. Although that's legitimate too, you know, to take interest in different things that are happening around the world. But the fact is that the Canadian government has identified itself as the world's strongest supporter of Israel. And when questioned, well, what about the United States? John Barrett said, well, we'd like to think of ourselves as even closer. So when we say that these things, so that, I mean, obviously it's a challenge, and one of the reasons why it's a challenge to mobilize is because the Canadian state is strongly in support of Israel and always has been, so we see that reflected in mainstream media and elsewhere. That's one reason why we did the Transnet campaign, because the idea was to bring the information about Palestine to where people are, as well as a link where they could get more information. Because people have seen this map of the region, but a lot of times there have been surveys where people think that what's happening is that Palestinians are occupying Israel. And that's the root of the problem, because there's been so much discussion and so much delegitimization of Palestinians taking place like from government officials and mainstream media, and people think that's the root of the problem. So the first thing is like that's the point about having a transit act and doing things like that when we do have to fundraise to do them, but it's to try to get the message out to a wider group of people. And in fact, one of the widest ways we got the message out to people was because it was the front cover of the Province for a day. It was on CTV, it was on CBC, we had more media than we could ever have been able to purchase through fundraising. We raised $15,000, even that took a year. So, you know, by and large, yeah, the movement's kind of unresourced. But at the same time, that's why we're starting groups and organizations. So we have like groups like SAMIDOUN, we have groups like the Boycott Israeli Apartheid campaign in Vancouver. And the thing about BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign, is that it is something that people can take up on their own and bring into their own universities, their schools, their unions, their organizations, and work with. Because there are groups that have investments in Israeli bonds, for example, or schools that have investments in G4S. And it becomes a way to campaign about what's happening in a way that's really directly related to one's local community and one's environment. It's something that we're working on. The Canada Pension Plan has investments in major military contractors, and so we're part of a campaign to stop the Canada Pension Plan from doing that, because again, that's something that can affect each of us in our own kind of local communities. And if anyone here is also interested in like working to build a movement around BDS or anything like that, or spreading the word about Palestine, you know, we'd be happy to work with you to do that and to take on some of that stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge. It is interesting the way the internet's played into that in terms of like spreading information, but both the Palestinian national movement, which has existed for a very long time, and even the solidarity movement existed before the internet, and maybe sometimes we were even more connected because we were reaching out one-on-one to people. So there's, you know, benefits and challenges that come from that. But I think there's a lot of organizing that we still have the potential to do.
Just to say it more slowly so that because it might be interesting. It's called, when she says BDS, it's Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is like a three-pronged strategy that worked in I don't know if you studied this, but in South Africa under the apartheid system. What year did that end?
Well, the official elections were like 93 and 94. And of course, apartheid is over.
It's still not over. But there was a large mobilization of students in Canada and the U.S. even, but around the world. And it was the attention of mostly like students on university campuses running these boycott campaigns, saying this is where our campus is invested in South Africa, and saying we refuse to bring South African goods to Canada and to the U.S. They actually put the economic pressure on the state enough that it got their attention, and that was the pressure along, of course, with the pressure on the ground, the resistance of the communities on the ground. But the international side of it was helpful to those people resisting on the ground because it made them feel less alone. And it also brought home the economic connections, which is even more today under neoliberal globalization, the intricate reliance of various, corporations on these systems. It's quite, it's easier to track perhaps, but it's also easy for us to get involved and to say where specifically, like G4S, there was a truck just in front of me today. G4S is here. And I have friends in London who are working on a massive G4S campaign against surveillance that's targeting poor communities in London at the same time as G4S is in Israel. So the connections are direct and it's not abstract.
Also, just to note, like in Canada, there have been 7 student unions that have, just in the past year, passed resolutions that they support their own divestment, like going for their own investments and making sure they're not investing in corporations like G4S or military contractors that are aiding the occupation, and that they're going to call on the university as a whole to do that with their own endowment funds. And we've seen 7 universities, major universities across Canada. I think the last one was the York University Federation of Students in Toronto just a couple of months ago. And so this is all just in the past year. People have been calling for boycott of Israel for a long time, but the BDS campaign, especially on campuses and in local communities, in food co-ops and things like that, has actually grown remarkably, especially I would say since 2009 and 2008, when Israel engaged in what was called Operation Cast Lead, a war on Palestinians in Gaza, in which 1,400 people were killed and a great deal of devastation was wreaked on Gaza. And it actually provoked a lot of international solidarity. And since that time, we've seen they've used white phosphorus and other internationally banned weapons. And I mean, there are many things to say about that, but we've definitely seen the media movement grow since that time.
Again?
Go back to her.
Sure.
Oh, I just want to say, what's your guys' vision in order to like balance the rights of Palestinians and the new generation of those who live in Israel? Because I mean that's important too, like their rights to be considered as well. Like, so if there's so much focus on giving it back to the Palestinians, well, what are the ones that are living there and need the economy, need the work and stuff? So it's like it's a kind of I don't know how. What would you guys' vision be like? Are they to cohabitate, or when you want to boycott, Israel? There are still the innocent ones that live there that need to support as well. So,
with the specific demand that they drop this war.
Yeah, I think that the relationship between the colonized society and the people under occupation or colonization, it's the master-slave relationship. So the vast majority of Israelis are benefiting from the system. And if you talk about, for example, workers, I myself was a worker at age 12 in an Israeli factory, and all of us were Palestinians, and there were no Israeli workers in that factory, but on the top management you would see Israelis. So the relationship is not exactly, if there is like an Israelis who are engaged in the struggle or their, impoverished sectors, or there are, but these are mostly Jews who come from Africa, or what they call them the Sephardim, because even within Israel there is racism against some of the Jews themselves, the sectors of, but there is no relationship between the two populations, because that's why it's an apartheid, because they say they are there and we are here, so there is no relationship between the two people, only on the form of we see army in our areas and we know that they're Israelis, but they never come to our areas, or we are allowed to go to the areas that were occupied in 48 and have a social or normal relationship, because the occupation will forbid that. It will not equal. Also, unfortunately, in Israel, since the very beginning education years, like grade 1, there is a system of racist education, and so they grow up thinking of Palestinians as those are the Arabs and the killers and who wants to kill us, and we are surrounded they grow up with this idea of they are the one who is the oppressed. And so they just, in order to justify the state, massacres and wars against Palestinians, and anything becomes justifiable in the eyes of the public, and that's when it's dangerous. I mean, when it's a state or an army, that's what they're there for. But when it's the entire society fall into this racist darkness, the struggle becomes harder, and that's why our task as Palestinians is not just to liberate Palestinians, but also to liberate Israelis from racism and from this darkness that they live in order to live as equal human beings.
Yeah, I just want to know what's the difference in the quality of life of their Israelis compared to, not including the refugee camps, but just normal things like the school systems or I don't know, how nice the houses are, or the jobs, what's the difference there?
Well, just to actually clarify something about the refugee camps in particular, when we're talking about the refugee camps in the West Bank or in Gaza, these are camps that have been there since 48, and so these are marginalized communities and oppressed communities of people, but these have also become miniature cities. They're just cities that are grown out of refugee camps. So you actually have huge population centers there. It's not people living in tents anymore. It's people living in houses, and those houses are definitely of much lower quality. But just to be clear that we're not talking about marginal sector of society, but actually a large portion of the society. By and large, you see vast inequalities. As Khaled said, there are marginalized and impoverished sectors of Israeli society, but when you drive through an area, one thing that's really easy to compare, and kind of you see it all the time, is the comparison between the settlements and where Palestinians are living. So when you're going through an area with settlements, you'll see Israeli settlements. These are Israeli settlements that people have been funded and supported and provided with arms and military support by the Israeli government to set up what are called settlements or colonies in the West Bank, often on raised areas, on hilltops, on the best agricultural land, and elsewhere throughout the West Bank. Basically everywhere that there aren't Palestinians currently there, and even some places where there are Palestinians currently there, are subject to land being confiscated by the military, often being put under a military order, and then being turned over to a settlement for settlement construction. And so that's why you always hear about the settlements and settlement freezes and settlement construction, is because these settlements are on a daily basis encircling Palestinian cities and Palestinian villages. And it's not just there's some people who live there and they build a house. Those settlements are massive military installations. They have detention centers in them. They have armed settlers and armed soldiers with guns. They have checkpoints. They have bypass roads. Once a settlement is built, Palestinians no longer have access to go from one city or one village to another. Instead, routes that used to take 10 or 15 minutes now take 2, 3, 4 hours or all day, because Palestinians are spent driving around and around and around all over the country to get to evade the settlements. And so when we look at, for example, water usage, each settler is given, I think, approximately 10 times the amount of water that Palestinians are given, and the largest aquifer in the area is directly under the West Bank. So even if you're going in the kind of really traditional, Palestinian state and the West Bank idea, this is Palestinians' water, no question about it. And instead it's all being given to settlers while Palestinians have water shortages on a constant basis. Unemployment is extremely high, poverty is extremely high, and Israel is constantly trying to promote itself as a high-tech paradise, as a tourist dream. In fact, the way that the Israeli state promotes itself is by its wealth. And that wealth, despite the fact that Israel has this vast wealth that it promotes itself with all the time, it's still being given, say, by the United States $3 billion a year in military aid and weapons and most advanced weapons and equipment. And so all of that wealth has been extracted on the backs of the colonization and dispossession of the Palestinian people. And it's a vast disparity. Now, there are certainly wealthy Palestinians statistical comparison. There really is no comparison to be made when you're looking at people. Yes, well, I mean, the situation of Gaza being under siege as a whole, is an intensely difficult situation where there are massive fuel shortages. When Israeli fuel is allowed to enter Gaza, it's extremely expensive and people can't afford it. Cars have basically disappeared from the streets. Many times there is only electricity for half of the day or a quarter of the day. Whereas, and this is one of the problems, for the average Israeli, people can go through life pretending that they're not colonizers, that there's not a war going on, that there's not an occupation, and that life is just normal and lovely and wonderful and fine, and that we're part of Europe, and that why are we here in this area with and this is Israel always seeks to enter, say, European competitions and identifies itself as not being of the region and not being of the area. That's what life is like for the average Israeli. And for the average Palestinian, life is very different. And there's not just poverty and unemployment, there's the constant threat of imprisonment and checkpoints and a lack of access to the basic things that make life easy to live.
And before the creation of the State of Israel, if you were to go to, study Palestine history in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, we had an advanced economy. In Palestine, we had 3 ports. In a city like Jaffa, we had, music schools and a university and movie theater. You have established cities in Palestine. After the occupation, because Palestinians, the vast majority of them they depend on farming, and the land is gone and occupied, so they became sort of the workers or the reserve working labor force in Israeli economy. And Israel will allow 5,000 Palestinians, for example, to come and work today. If tomorrow they don't need them, they will deny them permits, and so, Also, the very first laws that Israel have passed, military laws, after the occupation, were that Palestinians cannot import or export. Palestinians cannot establish any factory without military permits. Palestinians cannot dig a well. You cannot dig a well for water without a military permission. So basically, because at the final analysis, occupation is about a privileged minority who wants to make profits and money at the expense of the others. So that's why we start seeing the shifting of balance of how Israelis are living in almost like, Canada, Sweden, the U.S., while Palestinians are basically living in slums. So
there's also been campaigns by some activists here to go against the blockade of the port and against siege of Gaza, and they've been brutally suppressed by the Israeli military as the ships come in. There was 2 ships recently. The one was called Sersha, and they were stopped by the Israeli military, by the Navy, on the water, and people were killed, actually. So people definitely were arrested, and the supplies, which were medical supplies and fuel and things for the people, were complicated. So it's been very difficult as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment and leave people with something to think about that's a little closer to home. Just the sense that this mass imprisonment is really a function of colonization. And so here in Canada, Native folks make up roughly 3 to 4% of the population and about 25% of the prison population. I don't know if you all know this, but this is there's a massive overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canadian prisons as well. You go to some prisons on the prairies, and the percentage of folks in there who are Native are like 80%, 90%. So there's a way in which this kind of model of incarceration is a part of this whole way that colonial societies are built. It's inspiring that Palestinians are extremely conscious of the fact that this is a political tool being used to oppress them. Unfortunately, in Canada, it's often just there's often an assumption that it's associated with just criminal behavior or whatever, abuse or drug abuse or whatever. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we also live in a society that's based on colonization and the dispossession of people's land. And the question, there was some questions about like what's your vision of liberated Palestine. Those are complicated questions for folks that are in Palestine or that are in the national liberation movement, and will eventually be complicated questions for people who are the colonizers and settlers there to work out. We're going to have to struggle with the same kind of questions here, and I think Idle No More kind of started to put those questions on the agenda of what does it really look like to have justice for Indigenous people in Canada, because it definitely doesn't look like locking them up and putting them in jails, which is what the Canadian state is doing now. So again, this is something that seems to be happening a long way away, but these are questions that are relevant in our time and place too.
Any further questions? Joe?
I was just wondering if you could comment on how much more confusing, or if you think it makes it more confusing, the different religions makes it, and also do you have more issues trying to get U.S. support because they're like Christian support, usually supporting the Israel state?
Well, I mean, the thing is that, and this is something that we're always pretty careful to point out, is that it's not a religious struggle, and that people of different religions, including Judaism, were living together in Palestine prior to 1948. And then also, like, to clarify the difference between, and that includes like Arab Palestinian Jews, which is a different issue also than the process of colonization that the Zionist movement started, because again, that wasn't a process of immigration. That was a process of colonization for the goal of establishing what would become, quote-unquote, a Jewish state as it was self-defined, and that Jewish state would mean the replacement of any form of sovereignty or determination over the land and over the future of that state by the indigenous Arab population, which included Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And I'm sure people of other and of no belief as well. We're often told the story here that what's happening in Palestine is a religious battle, and it's between Muslims and Jews, and it's been going on for hundreds of years and thousands of years. But it hasn't been going on for hundreds of years and thousands of years. It's been going on since 1948, and if you want to go back a little further, since 1897 when the first Zionist Congress was held in Switzerland. It hasn't been going on before then. And it's not an eternal battle, and it doesn't. There are certainly people that use religious motivation, kind of, the reason why you have the right to settle West Bank land is because it's Judea and Samaria. And the reason why you have the right to occupy Palestine 48 and create a state called Israel is because, it's the kingdom of David and the kingdom of the Bible and reviving the temple and kind of all of this language. And we certainly see that in U.S. discourse, which is another issue to get to. But Zionism is rooted as a secular movement. It was founded by secular thinkers, and its goals always seem to neatly line up with securing the most power and profit for the Israeli state and those who rule it. So it's not a religious conflict, and it's not a battle over religion. It's a battle over freedom and justice and human rights and dignity. In the U.S., we certainly see Christian Zionism, and we see certain elements of that here too, as often the most kind of right-wing expressed form of Zionism, which is often associated with the idea that when Jews are quote-unquote ingathered in Israel, there will lead to Armageddon and the second coming of Christ, and there's a whole set of religious theory around this, which leads to Christian televangelists and others kind of mobilizing forces and bringing people out to support settlements, to support Israel, and to support the Israeli state and all that it does, and to demonize Palestinians as well. But again, what we see is that the profile and the agenda of these right-wing Christian televangelists and other political figures in the U.S., once again lines up neatly with the interests of the U.S. ruling class and major military corporations in extracting profits. And so, yeah, religion is used as a tool to make the situation worse. It absolutely is. And for some people who are oppressed, religion is a way of finding some hope and looking for a future without living without oppression. But the fundamental struggle is over power, it's over land, it's over money. It's a struggle to preserve colonialism by those that benefit from it, and a struggle to be free of colonialism by those that are oppressed by it. And so that's why it's, when it's turned into an issue of religion, it actually tends to distort what the reality of Palestine is and what the reality of the issue is, which is that Palestine is a struggle for everybody to be involved in and to support if you care about human dignity and human justice. And I think it's a really important point that Ayana's made as well. Just as much as the struggles of peoples here, and particularly the indigenous people of this land, it's really important for all of us to support those movements as much as possible, recognizing our own role and complicity in settler colonialism here, and therefore working to end it and bring about a greater form of justice. And so, that's what Palestine is about. It's not a religious battle. It's not complicated, and it hasn't been going on for thousands of years. It's been going on for the past century. But if people unite and work to support the Palestinian movement, which has been leading this movement for all of that time, and work to kind of stop the role of people like Stephen Harper, John Baird, and the Canadian state, then we can support seeing a new future for Palestine that's more like what Khaled was talking about and what Benjamin Netanyahu wants to see.
Is there anything further? Well, thank you very much for coming. And after you've listened and you've heard, we would like to, again, I passed it around earlier, but if you'd like to get on the email list just for future events from SAMIDOUN, feel free to leave your email here on this. And thank you very much for coming.
We'll see you all Monday in class, folks. Or Tuesday.